She accepted the only job the entire town swore was cursed, and it was precisely in the house of the most feared man in the whole region that she found what no one ever imagined she could deserve. Can you imagine what it is like to be judged for your own pain, to be marked by a widowhood that no one chooses, to the point that not a single soul in town reaches out a hand when you need it most? What drives a woman of only 24 years of age, entirely alone and drowning in a debt that wasn't hers, to knock on the door of the rancher everyone swore had a heart of stone? But this story happened in the heart of Texas, in the year 1887, in a small settlement called Oakhaven, where time ran slow and gossip ran fast. Before we continue this story that will touch your heart, I really want to know where you are watching from. Write down here below in the comments the name of your city and your state, so I can know how far this story has managed to reach. And if you like stories of true love, of overcoming, and of endings that make us believe in people again, go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because here at Tales of Yesteryear, every story is made with a lot of affection for you. Now settle into your chair, grab your coffee, and come with me to a Texas of red dirt and open sky, where a young widow was about to discover that life still had tenderness kept in store for her. The town church bell was striking 6 times when Cora Reynolds finished folding the last dress into her chipped wooden trunk. It was her wedding dress, put away for 6 years, yellowed in the folds, carrying an old scent of lavender and of things one insists on not forgetting. She ran her hands slowly over the fabric, like someone caressing the forehead of the sick, and then closed the lid before the memories could rise to her eyes. There was no time to cry. The sun was already setting behind the hills, and by morning she would need to be on her feet, with all her courage gathered up to do the very thing she had sworn never to do. It had been only 4 months since Cora buried her husband. Jacob Reynolds had died of a sudden fever, the kind you see enter a house but never see leave, taking with it the man she had loved since she was 17. He had left behind a young wife, a rented farmhouse with a roof begging for repairs, and an old debt whose true size Cora only came to understand later, when the creditors started knocking on her door with papers in hand and no patience in their eyes. What she discovered little by little was that Jacob had co-signed as a guarantor for a cattle deal that had gone sour, a deal she had never heard of, and now, with her husband dead, the entire collection fell squarely upon her narrow shoulders. If widowhood was already heavy, the town made a point of making it unbearable. There was something about the figure of a young widow that bothered Oakhaven, as if the beauty that still lingered on Cora's face was an offense to the mourning expected of her. Married women squeezed their husbands' arms when she walked by. Single women whispered behind their fans on their way out of Sunday service, and the older church gossips, led by a certain Mrs. Martha Higgins, had turned Cora's name into the favorite subject of their evening gatherings, seasoning other people's lives with the spice of tall tales. They said that a woman who is widowed so early must have attracted disgrace. They said that perhaps she herself had hastened her husband's illness. They said so many things that over time Cora learned to walk down the street with her eyes cast down, not out of shame for what she had done, but out of sheer exhaustion from what they invented. On that last night in the rented farmhouse, she counted the coins she still had tied up in a handkerchief. They were few, so few they would fit in the palm of a child. The landlord had already warned her that by the turn of the month he would need the house back, for it wasn't a charity home, and the cattle debt kept growing like weeds after the rain. Cora ran her fingers over the pine table, where she had so often served dinner to her husband, looked at the cold cast-iron stove, the crooked cross on the wall, and understood she was alone in a way she didn't even know was possible. She had no father. He was long dead. She had no mother, taken by another fever in another winter. She had no siblings nearby. She had only herself, her stubborn honesty, and a pair of hands accustomed to hard work. It was then that the name of the Hopewell Ranch came to her mind, bringing a shiver with it. It was the largest property in the region, lands that stretched further than the eye could see, with corrals, a mill, vast fields, and a grand main house with tall windows that could be seen from afar atop a hill. Like a silent castle, and it belonged to Colonel Theodore Vance, the man the town always spoke of in hushed tones. It was said he had been a widower for years, having lost his wife to a sudden fever, and that since then he had closed himself off like a house with locked doors. It was said he was hard, cold, stingy with words and smiles, that he had fired more foremen than any rancher in the county, that no one could stand working under his silence. The maids in town swore that Hopewell lacked joy, and that the boss went days without saying more than necessary, wandering the halls like a ghost. But it was also the only place for miles around where a lone woman could find honest work and a roof over her head, and Cora wasn't in a position to be picky. Courage, she thought, is what's left over when fear has outlived its usefulness. And it was with this thought that she fell asleep on that last night, or pretended to, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, and her heart beat against her ribs, as if trying to flee before she did. When the dawn broke, Cora put on her most decent dress, a faded but clean grey cotton, pinned her dark hair up in a severe bun, slipped on her usual lace-up boots, and took the only bundle she deemed important to carry. She left her trunk with a trusted neighbour, an old farmer named Silas, the only one in the entire settlement who still treated her with respect, and asked him to keep her few belongings until she had a steady place to lay her head. The old man, with teary eyes, told her that the good Lord would watch over her, and that bad folks aren't the ones who suffer, they're the ones who cause suffering. Cora tucked that phrase into her chest, like someone keeping a warm coat for the cold that was yet to come. The walk to Hopewell took up a good part of the morning. Cora followed the red dirt road that cut through the prairie, feeling the sun slowly warming her neck, the smell of dry grass and wild yellow prairie flowers rising from the ground, the sharp call of the meadowlarks in the distance. The dust clung to the hem of her dress, sweat trickled down her temples, and at every bend in the road she repeated to herself that she wouldn't turn back. She passed through the worn wooden gates, walked down the avenue of tall trees leading up to the main house, and felt her stomach tighten at the sheer size of it all. There were ranch hands driving cattle in the distance, the low mooing echoing through the valley, the strong smell of the corral and dew-soaked earth. There was a silent order in every corner, as if the entire ranch breathed while holding its voice. It was a plump woman in an apron who received her at the kitchen door at the back of the grand house. Her name was Bessie. She had been the cook for over 20 years, and she had a round face where kindness seemed to have settled in spite of everything. Bessie looked Cora up and down, noticed her calloused hands, the dusty hem of her dress, the eyes that begged without asking, and something in her softened. She asked what the young woman wanted, and Cora, straightening her spine, answered with the firmest voice she could find that she came looking for work, that she did a bit of everything, that she washed, cooked, sewed, tended gardens and houses, and that she wasn't afraid of any heavy chores. Bessie sighed, said the house did indeed need the help, but the final word wasn't hers, and the colonel was harder to please than ever. Still, she told the young woman to come in, sit on a kitchen bench and wait, offering her a tin cup of black coffee and a piece of warm cornbread, the first gesture of kindness Cora had received from a stranger in months. While she waited, Cora observed the spacious kitchen, the hanging copper pots, the wood stove that was always lit, the braids of garlic and onions hanging from the ceiling beams. There was abundance there, an abundance she hadn't seen in a long time, but there was also a strange silence hovering over the house, a silence that wasn't of peace, but of things kept locked away. Through the window, in the inner courtyard, she spotted a rosebush. It was a large rosebush planted in a well-crafted stone bed in the finest spot of the garden, right in plain sight of anyone arriving. But it was dead. Its twisted dark branches reached up to the sky like clenched fingers, without a leaf, without a bud, without a sign of life. Someone, once upon a time, had taken great care of that rosebush. You could tell by the craftsmanship of the flower bed, and someone later on had let it die of sadness. Cora didn't know why, but that dead rosebush squeezed her chest in a way she couldn't explain, as if she recognized in it a portrait of what life itself had done to her. Bessie returned shortly after saying the colonel would see her, and warned her softly, almost like a prayer, not to be frightened by his manners, to speak little, answer directly, and not to look away, because a man who has suffered a lot respects those who face him head-on more than those who shrink away. Cora thanked her with a nod, smoothed her skirt with sweaty hands, and followed the cook down the hallways of polished hardwood floors, passing by old portraits and heavy, dark oak furniture, until they reached a tall door of dark wood. Bessie knocked lightly. A deep voice from inside ordered them to enter, and the old woman pushed the door open, announced the visitor, and withdrew, leaving Cora before the man the entire town had taught her to fear. Colonel Theodore Vance's office was a room with high ceilings, lined with shelves of leather-bound books, with a large desk by the window where the morning light poured in. And there, behind the desk, he sat. Theodore was younger than Cora had imagined from the gossip, perhaps just over 35, but there was a severity in his face that aged him. An ancient exhaustion settled deep within his dark eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair showing a few grey strands at the temples, and a short, neatly trimmed beard. He dressed with sobriety, without the exaggerations other wealthy ranchers liked to flaunt. He didn't smile when she entered. He merely lifted his eyes from the papers he was examining and sized her up with a gaze that seemed to see more than the young woman would have liked to show. He asked her name, and Cora replied that her name was Cora Reynolds. He asked where she hailed from, and she said from town, from Oakhaven. Hearing the surname and the origin, something crossed Theodore's face, a quick shadow, as if that name meant something to him, but he made no comment. He asked if she knew what was said about the ranch and about him in the settlement, and Cora, remembering Bessie's advice, looked him in the eye and answered honestly that she did, yes, that they said he was a difficult man, and that no one lasted in his service, but that she hadn't come there looking for easy conversation, but for work. Theodore raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by her frankness, and for a moment the silence between them grew so thick you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Then he wanted to know why such a young woman was looking for work so far from town, and Cora felt her throat close, but she didn't back down. She recounted without drama and without self-pity that she had been a widow for 4 months, that her husband had died of a fever, that she was left with a debt she hadn't made and a house she could no longer keep, and that in town there was no work for a lone woman, only the mouths of people ready to judge. She said all this with a firm voice, though her hands trembled hidden in the folds of her skirt. Theodore listened in silence, without interrupting, and when she finished, he spent a long moment just looking at her, as if weighing on some invisible scale not only her words, but the whole woman. It was then that he said something Cora hadn't expected. He explained, with a deep voice and no beating around the bush, that in his house there was no room for whining or laziness, that the work was hard and the days were long, but that he paid fairly and on time. Something, he assured her, not all bosses in the region could say for themselves. He added that he didn't care what the town said about her, because he had learned, the hard way, that the people's tongues rarely hit the truth. And, to the surprise of Bessie, who was listening behind the door with her heart in her hand, the colonel said Cora could stay, starting that very day to help in the house and the kitchen, with a room in the back, food and a monthly wage. Cora felt her knees weaken with relief and had to force herself not to let the tears fall right there in front of that man of stone who, without knowing it, had just given her back a piece of ground to stand on. The first days at Hopewell were about learning fast and speaking little. Cora woke up before the sun, when the prairie was still blue with mist, helped Bessie light the stove, strain the coffee through a cloth sieve that was already the color of smoke, bake the bread, and prepare lunch for the ranch hands. Then came the main house, the floors to wax, the furniture to dust, the bed linens to change, the sewing to mend. She worked with a quiet dedication, the kind that doesn't fish for praise, and Bessie quickly noticed that this young woman didn't do anything halfway. She wiped a window pane until it mirrored the sky. She folded a sheet as if she were folding a prayer. And she sang softly when she thought no one was listening. Old folk hymns her mother had taught her, and the kitchen seemed to grow warmer when she sang. The house, however, kept a heavy silence that Cora gradually learned to decipher, like someone reading a map in the dark. There was a hallway on the second floor that no one walked down, with a door always shut, and Bessie, when passing by, lowered her voice and quickened her step. There were times when the colonel locked himself in his office and didn't want to be disturbed by anything or anyone. There were dinners served at a long table where Theodore ate alone, by the light of a single oil lamp, without exchanging a word, staring at his plate like a man fulfilling an obligation rather than nourishing himself. Cora served the food in silence, cleared the plates in silence, and often saw him there, motionless, looking out the window into the darkness of the valley, with an untouched glass of wine in front of him and an invisible weight upon his broad shoulders. Little by little, she pieced together the history of that man, not because she asked, for she didn't, but because Bessie, on a sunny afternoon while they were peeling potatoes on the kitchen bench, decided to tell her. She told her that the colonel hadn't always been like this, that there had been a time when Hopewell was a house of parties, of music, of people laughing in the hallways, that Theodore had married young, deeply in love, to a girl named Lavinia, as pretty as a ray of sunshine, joyful enough to make jaws drop. It was Lavinia who had planted the rosebush in the courtyard, Bessie recounted with a choked voice, and she tended to it every day, watered it, pruned it, talked to the blooms as if they were people. She used to say that, as long as that bush gave roses, there would be love in that house. But Lavinia had fallen ill suddenly 7 years ago, during the rainy season, victim to a violent fever that swept the region and which no medicine of the time could cure. And since that night he lost her, the colonel had ordered the master bedroom locked, forbade her name to be spoken, and never let anyone touch the rosebush again, which slowly dried up, until it became that twisted skeleton Cora had seen from the window. Hearing that, Cora suddenly understood the weight of the silence living in that house. It wasn't coldness, it was mourning. He wasn't made of stone, he was a wound that had never healed. And without meaning to, she looked at the colonel with different eyes from that day on, not with fear, but with a kind of respectful compassion, the way only those who have lost a lot can understand pain. Because Cora knew what it was like to bury someone you love. She knew what it was like to wake up in the morning and be startled, remembering that the other side of the bed was empty. She knew what it was to keep living when half your soul was already gone. And perhaps it was because of this that, without making a conscious deal with herself, she began to care for that house, not like someone doing a chore, but like someone nursing a sick patient who needs, little by little, to learn how to live again. Theodore, for his part, was a man who noticed everything without saying a word. He noticed that the food was seasoned better after the young woman arrived. He noticed that his shirts came back from the washboard, smelling wonderfully of soap and sunshine. He noticed that the house was cleaner, airier, and that even the light seemed to pour differently through the windows she opened in the morning. But what bothered him most, in a way he couldn't name, was that the woman didn't fear him. Everyone on the ranch treated him with a frightened reverence, measured their words before him, averted their eyes. Not Cora. When he spoke, she looked him straight in the face, answered properly, without submission and without insolence, just with a quiet dignity that disarmed him. And there were nights when Theodore caught himself thinking about the new maid, when he should have been thinking of other things, and this irritated him deeply, because it had been 7 years since he had thought of any woman, and he had sworn to himself he never would again. The routine at Hopewell, which at first seemed to Cora an immense and strange world, slowly became solid ground beneath her feet. She learned the rhythms of the house, everyone's preferences, the secrets of Bessie's wood stove, the exact way the Colonel liked his coffee, strong and without sugar, served before sunrise. She learned to distinguish the moo of hunger from the moo of distress in the corral, to recognize by the smell when the heavy rains were coming, to stitch the tears in the ranch hands' work clothes that no one had mended since the house lost its joy. And every little thing she fixed, every corner she left cleaner, every meal she prepared with care, slowly returned to that ranch, without any fuss, a domestic dignity that had been lost for 7 years. The friendship with Bessie, which had started with a tin cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread, grew into something like mother and daughter. The two spent their afternoons in the kitchen, peeling, pounding, kneading, and talking about life, and Bessie, who had raised Theodore since he was a boy and knew that house like the back of her hand, began trusting Cora with the old stories, the joys and the pains of that family. She told of the times of plenty and celebration, of Theodore's marriage to Lavinia, of the grief that fell over everything, and she cried and laughed telling it, and Cora listened and cried and laughed along. And so, between one pot and another, the two wove a bond that life would never undo. Bessie used to say that the good Lord, who had never granted her a family of her own, had sent Cora as a belated gift. And Cora, who had lost her mother so early, found in that plump, smoke-scented lap a comfort she thought was lost forever. Not that everything was easy, because ranch life is not for the faint of heart. There was a brutal week of drought where the well ran low and the cattle began to suffer, and it was Cora who, leaning over the ledger books and an old map of the property's watering holes, helped Caleb the foreman organize a rotation for the troughs and save the water in a way that not a single head of cattle was lost until the rain returned. Theodore noticed once again that this woman had a rare knack for seeing solutions where others only saw problems, and mentioned to Caleb in a careless moment that it had been a long time since the ranch had such a good head looking after things. Caleb, a man of few words and much observation, merely replied that Miss Cora was too good for a maid's work, and that the Lord would surely give her the place she deserved. And Theodore stayed quiet, chewing on that truth he himself had been feeling, but didn't yet dare to speak aloud. On Sundays, when the chores eased up, Cora made a habit of waking up earlier, dressing as carefully as possible, and praying alone by her bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the valley. She prayed for Jacob, for the souls of her parents, and gave thanks despite everything for the roof and the daily bread she finally had. On one of those Sunday mornings, Theodore saw her from a distance, silhouetted against the golden light, with her eyes closed and hands clasped, and watched that scene with a tightness in his chest he couldn't name, a mixture of respect, tenderness, and a strange yearning for a life he didn't even know he still desired. In that instant, without confessing it to himself, the Colonel understood that the presence of that woman in his house was no longer that of a servant, but of someone who, without asking permission, had been settling into the most locked-up rooms of his heart. And there were, amidst all this, the small moments no one plans, but that memory keeps forever. A gentle rainy afternoon, when the two of them, trapped indoors, ended up talking for hours by the window, watching the water streak the glass. A night when Cora, thinking the house was empty, sang an old hymn loudly while tidying the parlor, not knowing that Theodore was listening from the hallway, standing still, eyes closed, letting that voice wash away years of silence inside him. A morning when he brought her, without saying a word, a branch of wild yellow blossoms he had picked on the trail, placed it on the table where she worked, and left before she could thank him. They were nothings. They were almost nothing, but they were the kind of nothings that, added together, build everything, and Hopewell, without anyone decreeing it, was ceasing to be a house of mourning and returning to being, ever so slowly, a house of the living. One day, a small event began to change everything, as it is almost always the small things that change lives. The ranch's bookkeeper, a man named Arthur, suddenly fell ill and had to go down to the city for treatment, leaving the ledger books of Hopewell falling behind, right at the time when cattle buyers were starting to arrive for the year's business. Theodore, although he understood land and livestock like few others, never had the mind nor the patience for numbers, and he watched the books pile up on his desk with growing irritation. It was on one of those mornings, when Cora entered the office to leave his coffee, that she noticed the columns of numbers open on the desk, and at one of them, almost without thinking, she pointed a finger and said softly that there was a mistake there, that the sum of that column didn't add up. Theodore raised his eyes, caught between surprise and suspicion, and asked what she had said. Cora, realizing she might have spoken out of turn, stepped back a little, but then straightened her spine and explained that her father had been a merchant at the general store in town when she was a girl, and had raised her helping at the counter and with the sales ledgers, teaching her to read, write, and do sums from a young age, a rare thing for a woman in those times. She said she might be wrong, but that sum, if he cared to check, was short by a mistake of $15. The colonel, half in disbelief, took the ledger, redid the math slowly, and found that the young woman was right. The mistake was exactly where she had pointed. There was a silence. Theodore looked at that woman in a patched dress and working hands, as if seeing her for the first time. He asked if she would be capable of organizing the books until Arthur returned, and Cora, feeling her heart race, answered yes, that she would do the best she could. And so it was that, on top of the household chores, she began dedicating her afternoons to the office desk, leaning over the ledger books of Hopewell Ranch, with a pen in hand, and a talent that no one, least of all herself, imagined would change the course of so many lives. Because in those ledgers, between old sums and records, slept a secret that was about to wake up. The afternoons in the office brought Cora and Theodore closer in a way neither had planned. He began to appear more frequently while she worked, at first with the excuse of checking some calculation, then with no excuse at all. He would sit in an armchair by the window, pretending to read the late newspaper that arrived from the capital, but in truth, observing her concentration, the way she gently bit her lower lip while adding up a difficult column, the way a strand of hair stubbornly escaped her bun and fell across her face, and how she tucked it back behind her ear with an absent-minded gesture. They spoke little at first, only what was necessary. But the necessary over time turned into conversation, and conversation turned into companionship, and companionship, without them realizing, turned into the only moment of the day both secretly looked forward to. On one of those afternoons, Theodore asked, without taking his eyes off the paper, how a woman who knew so much had ended up with such a hard life. Cora stopped her pen, thought for a moment and replied that life doesn't ask what you know before knocking you down, and that she had learned the hard way that pride doesn't pay debts or fill a plate. She said this without bitterness, almost with a half-smile, and Theodore, for the first time in a long while, felt the urge to smile too, though he hid it behind the newspaper. He asked if she didn't harbor anger toward the people in town who treated her so poorly, and Cora thought again before answering that anger was a poison you drink thinking it will kill the other person. She said she preferred to spend the strength she had building something, rather than wasting it chewing over what she couldn't change. And Theodore stayed quiet for so long after that, she thought she had upset him. But in truth, he was merely surprised to find, in the mouth of a maid, a wisdom that he, with all his fortune, had lacked during 7 long years of resentment. Time went by, the days threading into one another like beads on a rosary, and Cora's presence very slowly kept thawing that house. She opened the windows in the hallway that no one ever opened, let the sun in where there was only mildew and shadow. She placed wildflowers in a pitcher on the dining table, simple prairie flowers, and Theodore, who initially frowned upon seeing them, didn't order them removed. She began to serve dinner, striking up some random conversation, the price of salt, the delayed rain, a funny story from the kitchen, and gradually that man who ate in silence started to answer. First with one-word replies, then with full sentences, until one night Cora realized, with her heart skipping beats, that the two of them were talking at the table as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and that it had been a long time since she had seen such deep sadness on his face. There was a night, one of those full-moon nights, where the entire prairie looked silver, when Theodore couldn't sleep and came down to the parlor looking for a glass of water, and found Cora still awake, sitting near the window, mending a shirt he had torn doing chores by the light of the oil lamp. He stopped at the threshold, not wanting to startle her, and stood for a moment just watching that scene of domestic peace his house hadn't known in so long. She looked up, slightly embarrassed to be seen like that, and asked if he needed anything, and Theodore, instead of answering, pulled up a chair and sat right there, saying that sleep was playing hide-and-seek and that company was better than staring at an empty bedroom ceiling. And so it was, without planning to, that the two ended up talking deep into the early hours, their voices low so as not to wake the house, while outside the crickets chirped and the moon rose slowly in the sky. In that conversation, Theodore spoke of things he told no one. He spoke of his father, a hard and hard-working man who had carved Hopewell out of the middle of nowhere, clearing brush and facing droughts and cattle disease to build it all from the ground up. He told of when he was young and dreamed of turning the ranch into the biggest in the county, of the plans he had made, of the ambition that once burned in his chest. And he told her, his voice suddenly dropping, that after losing Lavinia, all of it had lost its flavor, that the ranch kept growing but purely out of inertia, because he no longer knew for whom or for what he was hoarding so much land and so much cattle. He said he had discovered, the worst way possible, that no fortune fills the void of a house without laughter, and that he had spent 7 years rich on the outside and a beggar on the inside. Cora listened to it all in silence, and when he finished, she answered with that gentle wisdom of hers, saying that maybe life doesn't gather things for us to hoard, but rather to share, and that a land as good as that would only find its meaning again when it went back to sheltering the joy of people. She also spoke softly of her own old dreams, simple like herself, a modest house, a little garden, good folks around, the simple right to be treated with respect. The two fell silent for a time, the oil lamp flickering between them, and in that shared silence there was a new intimacy, the kind that brings people closer than any touch. When they finally realized that dawn was already breaking, they stood up a bit awkwardly, wished each other a good night that was already almost a good morning, and each retreated to their own corner with their hearts a little fuller and a little more frightened by the sheer size of what they were feeling. But not everything was peaceful, afternoons of ledger entries and conversation. Oakhaven, down below in the valley, had not forgotten the young widow who had vanished from everyone's sight, and when the news spread that Cora Reynolds went to work at Hopewell in the house of the widowed colonel, tongues sharpened like knives on a whetstone, it was Mrs. Martha Higgins, the very one from the church gatherings, who first let the malice loose, commenting on the way out of Sunday service with a feigned worried tone that it wasn't decent for such a young widow to live under the same roof as an unmarried man, and that only a woman of no shame would subject herself to that. The other ladies shook their heads, scandalized on the outside but delighted on the inside, and the gossip grew legs, ran from house to house, swelled, invented details that never existed, until it became almost a truth just from being repeated so much. They said Cora had hooked the colonel. They said she was after his fortune. They said a woman who buries her husband and moves right into another man's house can only have a rotten heart. The gossip reached Cora's ears through the milkman who came up to the ranch, and it hurt. It hurt deep, because there was nothing in her of what they invented. That night she cried softly in her back room, not for the injustice itself, which by now she knew well, but out of exhaustion from never being allowed to be seen for who she truly was. Bessie, who heard her, slipped in quietly, sat on the edge of the bed and said, with that simple wisdom of women who have lived a lot, that the people's mouths have no master, but the Lord does, and whoever walks straight has no need to run from any shadow. She also told the young woman not to give those rumors the power to decide her worth, because folks' worth is measured by what they do and not by what others say. Cora dried her face, thanked her, and fell asleep wrapped in that unexpected tenderness, promising herself she wouldn't let the malice of others sour the little bit of good life was handing her back. Theodore also caught wind of the rumors, and in a way no one expected. It was upon going down to town to handle business that he heard, in a corner of the general store, two men whispering about the colonel's new maid, with malicious snickers and insinuations that made his blood boil to his head. He didn't say anything right there because he wasn't a man to make a scene, but he rode back to the ranch with a clenched jaw and a smoke of anger in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt angry for her, and that scared him because it meant he cared, and caring was exactly what he had sworn never to do again. That night, he watched Cora serve dinner with newfound attention, noticed her carefulness, the dignity with which she carried a burden she didn't deserve, and he felt the urge to protect her from a world that insisted on being unfair to those who least deserved it. But he said nothing. Only, when he finished eating, he casually remarked, as if it were nothing, that at Hopewell he was the one in charge, and that as long as she wanted to be there, she would have work, a roof, and respect, no matter who in town it bothered. Cora understood the hidden message in those rough words, and it was the first time she felt, deep in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in ages, and which, with a start, she immediately tried to mistrust. It was around this time that Hopewell had one of the best harvests in living memory. The cattle fattened up nicely, the corn and beans yielded plentifully, and the storehouses filled with sacks, like hadn't been seen since the days when Lavinia was still alive. One morning, while serving coffee in the office, Cora worked up the courage and gently suggested that perhaps it would be a fine thing to throw a party for the ranch hands and their families, a night of thanksgiving for the harvest, as the country tradition dictates during the season of the patron saint. Theodore frowned, said there hadn't been a party in that house for years, that he didn't know if that was fitting anymore. But Cora, with the firm sweetness that was her trademark, replied that gratitude never stops being fitting, and that a land that gives so much deserved at least one night of joy for those who made it bear fruit. The colonel stayed quiet for a while, looking out the window, and finally grumbled that she should figure out the preparations. Then, like someone who yields reluctantly, but is already yielding willingly on the inside. And so, for the first time in 7 years, Hopewell filled with lights on a July night. Cora and Bessie spent days cooking, and the yard in front of the main house got a towering bonfire, strings of coloured paper flags crossing from one side to the other, long tables covered in peanut brittle, roasted sweet corn, apple cobbler, hot spiced cider for the elders, and plenty of hot food to chase away the chill of the hills. An old fiddle player from the area, named Old Jed, came with his son on the banjo, and when the first notes of a lively folk tune echoed across the yard, it was as if the whole house took a deep breath after years of holding it in. The ranch hands arrived with their wives, starched up in their Sunday best, timid at first to step so close to the main house, but soon letting loose in the simple joy of those who work the land all year round and rarely get a night just for themselves. Theodore appeared on the porch when the party was already lively, and for an instant the yard almost fell silent, all eyes turning to the boss, not knowing if he came to ruin the joy or bless it. But Cora, from the middle of the yard, looked up at him and smiled, an open, fearless smile, and made a discreet gesture inviting him down. And the colonel came down. He sat on a bench near the fire, accepted a tin cup of cider from Bessie's hands, who almost dropped the jug out of sheer astonishment, and sat there, watching those folks happy on his land, feeling the heat of the fire on his face, and a forgotten feeling warming him up inside as well. The hands, seeing the boss relaxed, began losing their fear, and one of them even risked a joke that made Theodore let out a short laugh, the first public laugh those folks had seen from him in years. At a certain point, a square dance formed, with old man Silas, who had come up from town for the party, acting as the caller, shouting the commands in his funny, drawn-out country drawl, pulling everyone into the lines. During one of these sets, before Cora could anticipate it, she was playfully shoved to fill the missing pair, right in front of the colonel, who had also been dragged in by force by two bold ranch hands. The two looked at each other, as bashful as two teenagers, and there was no way out. They had to dance. It was only the length of one song, of hands joining and letting go to the rhythm of the banjo, of glances meeting and darting away, of fingers brushing for a second longer than they ought to, but it was enough for both to feel their hearts skip a beat. When the music ended and the circle broke apart amidst laughter, Cora stepped away quickly, her face flushed with heat she tried to blame on the bonfire, and Theodore returned to his bench with a smile he couldn't hide, and Bessie, who never missed a detail, whispered to the neighbor beside her that something mighty good was being born there, and she felt it deep in her soul. But the night still held a gesture that would reveal, more than any dance, the size of Cora's heart. There was an old man among the hands named Old Amos, who had worked his whole life on the ranch, and who, already bent by age and a nasty cough he couldn't shake, hadn't been able to handle heavy chores for months, and lived downcast, terrified of being sent away with nowhere to go. Cora had heard the story from Bessie, and without making a fuss, she had sought Theodore out days earlier to ask that the old man be kept on the ranch for light duties, with the same roof and food as always. Because a man who gave his life to the land deserves to grow old on it with dignity. Theodore, moved by her cause, had agreed on the spot, and it was at that party, in front of everyone, that the colonel announced Old Amos would have a home and keep at Hopewell until the end of his days, and the old man, with wet eyes, came to kiss the boss's hand, which he didn't allow, shaking his hand man to man instead. The ranch hands understood that night that the arrival of this woman was changing not only the colonel, but the way all those folks were treated, and the loyalty they began to harbor for Cora was something no money could buy. When the party wound down, already late into the early morning, and the last hand had retired and the bonfire turned to embers, Theodore and Cora found themselves alone in the yard, gathering up the last remnants of the celebration. They worked side by side in silence for a time, and then the colonel, looking at the little flags still fluttering in the cold wind, said softly, almost to himself, that he had forgotten how good it was to hear laughter in that house. Cora paused, looked at him, and replied with tenderness that the house had never forgotten how to laugh. It was only waiting for someone to open the windows again. Theodore turned his eyes to her, and in the dark, illuminated by the glowing coals, there was one of those silences between them that say more than 1,000 words, a silence in which both knew, without confessing, that they were no longer master and maid, but two souls that life, through such winding paths, stubbornly insisted on drawing together. Time, which is the master of all things, continued to pass over Hopewell. The rains came and washed the prairie, green took over the fields, the cattle fattened, and with the rains came a new season in the lives of those two bruised souls. If you are enjoying this story so far, leave your like to help me bring tales of yesteryear to more people who need to hear a good story of love and overcoming. And tell me in the comments if you also believe that life always gives a second chance to those with a clean heart. Now come with me, because it was on an afternoon with a heavy sky that the barrier between those two hearts began, at last, to crumble. Cora had been living on the ranch for months when the thunderstorm episode occurred. It was late afternoon, the sky darkened suddenly, and a world-splitting downpour fell over Hopewell, with lightning that illuminated the whole valley and thunder that rattled the window panes. Theodore was in the corral, helping the hands gather the spooked cattle, when a lightning bolt struck too close, and a bolting steer pinned him against the fence, gashing his leg with an ugly cut and throwing him into the mud. They brought him into the house being carried, soaked, his trousers torn and blood mixing with the rain, and it was Cora who took charge before even thinking. She ordered water to be heated, fetched clean rags, whiskey, and the herbs Bessie kept, and knelt beside him to clean and dress the wound with firm hands that didn't tremble at the sight of blood. Theodore, who wasn't a man to let anyone fuss over him, tried to complain, tried to say he was fine, that it was just a scratch, but the pain was immense and her firmness didn't allow for stubbornness. Cora washed the cut, gritted her teeth while cleaning the dirt from the wound, while he gritted his not to groan, and she stitched it up with a needle and thread passed through the flame, with the delicacy of someone embroidering and the courage of someone who had nursed the sick her whole life. While she worked, the two were very close, closer than ever, her face illuminated by the trembling light of the oil lamp, her hair loose because her haste had undone the bun, and Theodore, between one throb of pain and another, caught himself looking at that woman like a man who rediscovers, after a long time in the dark, that there is light in the world. She suddenly looked up and caught him staring, and for a moment that seemed to last a century, they stayed like that, quiet. The rain beating hard on the roof, both their hearts beating even harder, until she looked away, blushing, and said with a slightly trembling voice that she was almost done, that he just needed a little more patience. When she finished the bandage, Cora stood up quickly, smoothed her skirt, gathered the rags, and was leaving when Theodore, on an impulse he himself didn't understand, called her by her name. It was the first time he called her Cora, and not Miss or you, and the name spoken by that deep voice made her stop in the doorway. He wanted to thank her, but the words failed him, and what came out was just a hoarse thank you, followed by a silence where a lot was said without any words being spoken. Cora replied that he didn't need to thank her, that anyone would do the same, and he almost said no, that no one there had done anything for him in 7 years like what she had just done. But he swallowed the words and simply nodded. She left, closed the door, and on the other side leaned against the wall with her hand over her chest, feeling her racing heart, frightened by what she was feeling and what she believed she didn't have the right to feel. From that stormy night onward, something changed between the two of them, an invisible current pulling them toward each other that both tried in vain to resist. Theodore, forced to rest because of his leg, spent his afternoons in the office while Cora managed the ledgers, and their conversations grew longer, deeper, discovering things in one another that no one else knew. He shared on one of those afternoons things about Lavinia he had never told anyone, not with the weight of a tombstone, but with the lightness of someone who finally manages to remember without falling apart, and Cora listened without jealousy and without rushing, understanding that whoever truly loved once carries that love, like carrying a lantern, not like dragging a chain. She, in turn, spoke of Jacob, of their simple marriage, of the dreams they didn't have time to realize, and the two of them, each with their own grief, discovered that shared pain weighs less, and that perhaps the Lord, in his mysterious ways, had brought two broken hearts together right there, precisely so one could help mend the other. While his injured leg still forced him to spare himself from heavy labor, Theodore made a habit of inviting Cora for walks in the late afternoon, when the heat eased and the prairie turned golden. Both claimed it was for the colonel to exercise his leg and get some fresh air, but the truth, which neither dared to speak aloud, was that those walks had become the most anticipated moment of the day. They walked along the banks of the creek, cutting through the ranch, under the shade of the great cottonwoods, and Theodore would point out to her the land he loved, explaining where each irrigation ditch came from, why he planted here and not there, how he had learned from his father to read the sky and guess the rain by the behavior of the ants. Cora listened, enchanted, and asked questions that revealed a sharp intelligence, and Theodore, who hadn't had anyone to share those things with in so long, discovered a forgotten pleasure in being listened to. On one of those afternoons, they reached the top of a hill overlooking all of Hopewell, stretched out in the valley, the corrals, the fields, the red roof of the main house gleaming in the setting sun. Theodore stopped there, leaning on the cane he still used, and stared at it all in silence, and then said something to Cora that moved her deeply. He said that for 7 years he had looked at that exact same landscape without seeing a thing, that the land had stayed beautiful, but he had gone blind to its beauty, as if Lavinia's passing had drained the colors from the world. And he said, turning to Cora, that lately the colors had come back, slowly, without him really knowing why, and that maybe, just maybe, she could guess the reason. Cora felt her face burn, lowered her eyes, and replied only with a restrained smile that the land had always been beautiful. It was just the heart of the beholder that sometimes needed time to see again. But both knew, up there on that hill, that they were talking about something else entirely. It was also during those days that Theodore insisted on teaching Cora how to ride properly, because as the daughter of a town merchant, she had never been comfortable around horses and struggled every time she needed to cross the ranch. He picked out an old, gentle mare for her named Beauty, and the lessons became a source of hearty evening laughter. Cora, clumsy, would slip from the saddle, fumble the reins, and Theodore, holding back laughter so as not to offend her, would patiently correct her, his hand sometimes resting over hers to adjust her fingers on the reins, a touch that made both pretend they felt nothing. During one of these rides, the mare misstepped and Cora nearly fell, but Theodore, moving fast despite his injured leg, caught her by the waist and steadied her, and for a moment they stood like that, very close, their faces mere inches apart, their breathing ragged, until Cora, blushing, thanked him and quickly stepped back, and Theodore, covering it up, said she was doing fine. She just needed to lose her fear, and both knew he wasn't just talking about the horse. At night, alone in her back room, Cora fought a silent battle with herself. She scolded herself for feeling what she felt, told herself it was madness, that she was a maid, that he was the boss, the richest man in the county, and that life had already taught her not to dream too high so as not to fall from too far. She remembered Jacob, the simple love she had known, and even felt a twinge of guilt for her heart beating like this again, so wildly for another man. But then she remembered the way Theodore looked at her, the tenderness hidden beneath that tough shell, the care in his small gestures, and she realized that this was no longer under her control, that the heart, stubborn thing, had a mind of its own, and had already chosen long before reason was even consulted, and she would fall asleep, torn between fear and hope, praying the Lord would guide her, and that if this was truly fate, it would be a fate of peace and not of new pain. Theodore, on his side of the house, fought a similar battle. He spent sleepless nights staring at the bedroom ceiling, arguing with his own heart. He felt guilty for the first time in 7 years, going whole days without visiting Lavinia's memory, for laughing, for looking forward to the late afternoon just to walk with a woman. But then, during one of those sleepless early mornings, a memory came to him of something Lavinia had told him, while still alive, in a conversation he had buried along with her, that if she were ever gone, she didn't want him locking himself away in grief, that life was for the living, and that the greatest waste in this world was a heart capable of loving, left to rot in the dark. That dawn, for the first time, Theodore wept not out of sorrow but out of relief, like someone finally receiving a permission that only he himself was withholding. And he fell asleep in peace, understanding that to honor those who have passed is not to die alongside them, but to live beautifully the time we have left. There were small gestures that meant more than any declaration. One morning, Cora found a brand new pair of reading glasses on the desk, the fine, wire-rimmed kind, left there without a single note, and she understood that Theodore had noticed her squinting while working on the ledgers in the fading afternoon light. She said nothing, he said nothing, but the glasses were always there from then on, and every time she put them on, she felt as if he were taking care of her from afar. Another afternoon, she was the one who noticed he loved a certain wild plum jam that Bessie rarely made, and she started asking the cook to make it more often, just to see on the Colonel's serious face that hint of a smile that appeared when the dish reached the table. They were nameless flirtations, care disguised as coincidence, the timid beginning of a feeling neither dared confess, not even to themselves, but which grew within that house the way a seed grows, in silence, beneath the earth. But every seed that grows draws the attention of those who prefer barren ground, and it wasn't long before the timid happiness at Hopewell attracted envy from the outside. It was around this time that the figure of Phineas Montgomery appeared in the area, a middle-aged man, owner of neighboring lands, and of an ambition as wide as the sky. Phineas was a widower, had a daughter of marriageable age named Dorothy, and had long nurtured the dream of joining his lands with Hopewell through a marriage between his daughter and the wealthy Colonel Vance. He was a smooth-talking man with a ready smile, the kind you learn to distrust precisely because they are too sweet, and he had been circling Theodore for some time with invitations to dinners, hunts, and business deals, always with his daughter nearby, always insinuating the advantages of a fine alliance between the two most prominent families in the county. When Phineas learned from the venomous mouth of Mrs. Martha Higgins that there was a young and pretty maid installed in the Colonel's house, and that rumours were flying that the widower was acting different, softer, seen more often in the company of this woman, he felt the foundation of his plans quake. He couldn't allow a nobody, a penniless widow with no connections, to cross the path to the fortune he already considered practically his. And so it was that Phineas Montgomery, beneath the mask of cordiality, began weaving behind the scenes a web to separate Cora and Theodore, allying himself with Mrs. Higgins's malice, and using all his influence to unearth whatever there might be in the widow's past that could tarnish her name forever in the Colonel's eyes. One afternoon, Phineas rode up to Hopewell accompanied by his daughter on the pretext of discussing the purchase of some head of cattle, but with the true purpose of observing up close the maid everyone was talking about. Cora served the coffee in the parlour with her usual discretion, and instantly felt the weight of that man's gaze upon her, a look that sized her up like someone calculating the cost of removing an obstacle. Phineas was polite in appearance, but dropped right in the middle of the conversation a venomous phrase cloaked in disguise, commenting with false kindness that it was admirable of the colonel to show such charity by sheltering folks with such complicated pasts, and that not everyone would have the greatness to ignore certain stories going around town. Theodore, who was no fool, caught the barb and replied dryly that the past of those who worked for him was nobody else's business, and that the region was in dire need of people who minded their own affairs. Phineas forced a tight smile, swallowed the insult, but left there with even greater hatred, determined to strike where Cora's armor seemed weakest, the debt left by her late husband. What Phineas didn't know, and what even Cora couldn't imagine, was that the key to everything lay exactly in those ledger books she had been organizing with such care. One night, when she stayed late in the office, by the light of the oil lamp, checking old ranch records, Cora came across a dusty ledger tucked away in the back of a drawer, a book from years ago, from the time when Hopewell still bought and sold cattle with half the people in the region. And there, amid names and numbers that initially meant nothing to her, she suddenly found a name that turned her blood to ice and made the pen slip from her fingers. It was Jacob's name, her deceased husband, and next to it the record of a cattle deal, the very same deal of the debt that hounded her, but with a piece of information that changed everything. With a racing heart, Cora read on, line by line, and what the numbers told was a story quite different from the one the creditors had shoved down her throat. That cattle deal Jacob had co-signed for didn't go sour by chance or bad luck, as she had always been told. There, in the cross-referenced buying and selling logs, were the traces of a swindle, a fraud set up by third parties who had used Jacob's good faith and signature to cover up a deficit that wasn't his. And even more astonishing, one of the names behind that scheme, hiding behind a middleman, was a name Cora had just met in person that very week, sitting in the parlor, drinking the coffee she herself had served. It was the name Phineas Montgomery. Cora stayed awake all night, clutching the ledger to her chest, not knowing whether to laugh with relief or cry with rage. Relief because, at last, she held the proof that the debt ruining her was the fruit of an injustice, and that Jacob, far from being a poor manager, had been the victim of a scam. Rage because the man responsible for so much suffering, the man who had left her a destitute widow, walked around free, wealthy, and respected, and now on top of everything was circling her life like a bird of prey. She thought about taking the book to Theodore immediately, but hesitated, afraid he might think she only got close to him out of self-interest, afraid of tainting what was blooming between them with the shadow of money and convenience. And so she kept the secret for a few days, the secret weighing heavy on her chest, unaware that Phineas, on the other side of the valley, was plotting to drop a bomb on her that would change everything. Phineas's strike came in a public and cruel manner on a Sunday after church service in Oakhaven, taking advantage of the colonel having come down to town and half the settlement being gathered in the churchyard. In front of everyone, with a voice loud enough that no one missed a single word, Phineas Montgomery, feigning civic indignation, declared it was a scandal that Colonel Vance was harboring a woman in his home who owed money to half the world, a deadbeat whose husband left unpaid debts all over the region, and insinuated, with false sorrow, that perhaps the widow was only cozying up to the colonel so he would pay off her debts. Mrs. Martha Higgins and her gossiping friends chimed in, scandalized, and a murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd, all eyes turning with disdain toward the name of Cora, who wasn't even there to defend herself. Theodore, who heard everything standing at the church doors, felt his blood boil, but restrained himself with a terrifying coldness. He looked Phineas up and down, and said with a low, cutting voice that silenced the entire churchyard that he found it curious for a man to worry so much about other people's debts, and that perhaps it would be good if certain old accounts in the region were reviewed more carefully, because sometimes the biggest debtor is exactly the one who shouts the loudest while pointing the finger. Phineas went pale for an instant, not entirely grasping the reach of the threat, but composed himself and smiled, thinking it was mere bluster. Theodore mounted his horse and rode back to the ranch with a storm inside him, torn between the anger at what he had heard and the venomous doubt that Phineas, with pure malice, had planted in his chest. What if it were true that Cora only approached him out of self-interest? The conversation between the two of them that night was the hardest of all. Theodore entered the office where Cora was working, closed the door and asked, without beating around the bush and with a hardness she hadn't seen in him for a long time, if it was true she had debts scattered across the region. Cora felt the floor open up beneath her feet, but she didn't lie. She answered yes, that there was a debt, the same one she had told him about on her first day, the debt from her late husband's cattle deal. Theodore, his voice choked with a hurt he himself didn't fully understand, then asked if she had gotten close to him because of it, if all of it, the conversations, the care, the glasses, the wild plum jam, if it was all nothing but a scheme so he would pay what she owed. And that was when Cora, wounded in what she held most sacred, which was her honor, rose from her chair with eyes full of tears and dignity, and told him the entire truth. She said she had never hidden the debt, that she had told him about it the very first moment she stepped foot in that house, when she didn't even know him and had nothing to gain by being sincere. She said she had never asked him for a single cent, that she'd worked every day for every coin of her wages, that she owed no favors to any man, and that she preferred honest misery over abundance bought with deceit. And she said, her voice trembling but without lowering her eyes, that if he truly believed she was capable of faking affection for money, then he hadn't understood a single thing about who she was in all those months. And in that case, it was best she leave the next morning, because she could handle hunger, the cold, and the malice of the whole town. But she couldn't stand living under the gaze of someone who judged her so low. The tears fell freely now, but there was more anger in them than weakness, and Theodore, facing that whole and truthful woman, felt like the smallest of men for having doubted her. It was then that Cora, determined not to leave a single shadow between them, went to the drawer, took out the dusty old ledger she had kept secret, opened it to the page that had robbed her of sleep, and placed it right before his eyes. She said she had found it days ago and hadn't had the courage to show him, precisely out of fear he would think what he had just thought. And she asked him to read it himself, with his own eyes, the truth about that debt. Theodore took the book, adjusted his glasses, and began reading, and as he read his face began to change, the hardness giving way to shock, the shock giving way to outrage, because there, written by the hand of the ranch's old bookkeeper, was the proof that the cattle deal that ruined Jacob had been a fraud, and that the true beneficiary of that scam, hiding behind a frontman, was none other than Phineas Montgomery. Theodore closed the book slowly, took off his glasses, ran a hand over his face, and stayed silent for a long time, digesting the magnitude of the injustice and his own foolishness for having, even for a moment, listened to someone else's poison. Then he looked up at Cora, and what was in his eyes now was no longer doubt, it was shame, and it was tenderness. He asked for forgiveness. A man who hadn't apologized to anyone in 7 years asked that woman for forgiveness with a choked voice, saying he had been unfair, that he let himself be poisoned by fear, and that she was absolutely right, because he hadn't understood anything, or worse, he had understood everything and had been terrified to admit it. And in a gesture that surprised them both, he took her hands in his, those hands calloused from so much work, and said he didn't want her leaving at all, that the house without her had become unbearable just to imagine, and that it had been a long time, far too long, since he had felt as alive as he felt when he was near her. Cora lost her breath. It was the first time he had opened up like that, and the touch of those large hands wrapping around hers made her heart nearly stop. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come, and the two stood there very close in the quiet office lit only by the oil lamp, feeling that an invisible line had just been crossed and there was no going back. Theodore reached up a hand and, with a gentleness no one would imagine from a man of such rough appearance, brushed a tear-dampened strand of hair from her face. There was no kiss, not yet, for both carried the old-fashioned respect of those who have truly loved and know that certain things have their proper time. But there was, in that gesture, more love than in 1,000 vows, and when Cora finally retired to her room that night, it was with a heart so full it hardly fit in her chest, frightened and happy in equal measure, understanding she was hopelessly in love with the man the whole town had taught her to fear. The days that followed had a newfound lightness, the kind that makes even heavy chores feel like dancing. Theodore and Cora no longer bothered to hide their joy at being together, although they still hadn't spelled it out in plain words. He began to accompany her on the afternoon walks along the creek, under the guise of getting fresh air for his healing leg, and they talked about everything and nothing, laughed at silly things, and sometimes their hands would brush as they walked and neither rushed to pull away. Bessie watched it all from the kitchen window with eyes welling up, thanking the Lord for seeing joy return to that house after so many years of shadows, and whispered to herself that it was too good to be true, and that she prayed nothing and no one would come along to ruin it. And little by little, Oakhaven itself began to change its tune. Because the truth has a stubborn way of surfacing, and those who came down to town to buy or sell brought news of Hopewell that no longer matched the old gossip. They now spoke of the colonel who had gone back to greeting folks on the road, of the ranch throwing parties and giving jobs, of the maid who helped those in need and harbored no grudges against anyone. Cora, when she went down to town to run errands, started noticing that certain previously hard looks were softening, that one woman or another would bid her good morning, that the owner of the general store attended to her with respect. The change was slow, because prejudice is a deep-rooted weed, but it was real, and every day more people felt ashamed of having fed the rumors against a woman who, it was now clear, had done nothing but work hard and be good. Old man Silas, the farmer who had been the only one to treat her with respect in her darkest days, became a frequent visitor at the ranch, walking up when his legs allowed, just to see, he'd say, his adopted daughter happy. On one of those visits, sitting in the shade of the porch with a coffee in his hands, the old man watched Cora and Theodore talking in the distance by the fence, and told Bessie, his eyes crinkling with age and emotion, that the Lord writes straight with crooked lines, and that girl, whom life had punished so harshly, was finally getting what she always deserved. Bessie agreed, dabbing the corner of her eye with her apron, and the two old souls sat there in silence, witnessing from afar the quiet miracle of two hearts finding each other. On a Sunday afternoon, Theodore sought Cora out holding a package as awkward as a schoolboy, and said it was a silly thing, that she shouldn't make a fuss. It was a shawl made of fine wool, blue as the late afternoon sky, which he had sent for from the big city. He explained, fumbling his words, that he noticed she got cold on their walks up the ridge, and that her thin dress didn't protect her properly. Cora unwrapped the gift with trembling hands, and upon feeling the softness of the wool between her fingers, she had to hold back her tears, because it had been so long since anyone noticed she was cold. Since anyone took care of something so small and so personal. She tried to refuse, said it was too fine for a maid. But Theodore, with a sweet firmness, replied that in his mind she had ceased being a maid a long time ago, and that he would be deeply hurt if she didn't accept. Cora accepted, and that afternoon, as she wrapped her shoulders in the blue shawl, she felt, for the first time in years, cared for as a woman, and not viewed as a burden or a scandal. But the happiness of those who have suffered deeply usually comes accompanied by an old fear, and Cora didn't escape it. The more her heart filled with Theodore, the more she was haunted by the dread of losing everything again, for life had already taught her with a heavy hand that joy can be ripped away overnight. There were nights she woke with a start, her heart racing, plagued by the thought that it was all too good to last, that she had no right to so much tenderness, that fate would charge a steep price for her audacity to be happy again. She confessed this fear to Bessie one afternoon, and the old cook, with the wisdom of those who have lost and survived, told her that being afraid of happiness is the last trick pain plays on us, and that a person can't live their whole life huddled up waiting for the next disaster, because that way you die in advance, every single day, without ever having truly lived. She said Cora deserved that happiness, and told her to grab onto it with both hands. Without guilt, the blessing the Lord was finally sending her. What neither Cora nor Theodore realized, distracted as they were in this timid dance of two hearts recognizing each other, was that, on the other side of the valley, envious eyes watched every step of that closeness with the sourness of someone watching a carefully built plan crumble. Phineas Montgomery hadn't swallowed the dry response he got from the colonel, nor had he forgotten the maid who dared exist in the way of his interests. And while love bloomed at Hopewell, on the neighboring ranch, the seed of vengeance was quietly germinating, because there are men who cannot stand other people's happiness exactly because they were unable to build their own. And Phineas was, unfortunately, one of those men. The clouds, though still distant, were beginning to gather on the horizon, and the newly won peace of those two was about to be tested like never before. But Phineas Montgomery wasn't a man to give up on his plans, and upon realizing his malice had only pushed the colonel and the widow closer together, he decided to launch his final attack, this time aiming not at Cora's reputation, but at the debt itself, which he, through his middlemen, arranged to buy from the original creditors. He thus became the owner of the debt's title, and with it in hand he rode up to Hopewell one morning, accompanied by a county bailiff, to demand immediate and full payment from Cora, knowing full well she had no way to pay, with the clear purpose of humiliating her in front of the colonel and perhaps forcing her arrest or her exile from the region. He arrived smiling, already tasting his victory, never imagining he was walking straight into his own trap. If you have made it this far, I am certain your heart is rooting for these two, so leave your like right now and comment the word justice down below. So I know you also believe that good always finds a way to win, because what happened that morning on the porch of Hopewell Ranch, no one in Oakhaven ever forgot. Phineas spread the papers over the porch table with a victor's flourish and declared in front of Theodore, Bessie, and some ranch hands who had stepped closer that he was now the rightful owner of the widow Reynolds' debt, and that he demanded payment on the spot, under penalty of taking from the woman whatever she had left and summoning her to court for defaulting. He gloated over every word, measuring the effect of the humiliation on Cora's face. But Cora didn't lower her head. On the contrary, she straightened her spine, looked that man right in the eyes, and said, with a calm that froze his smile, that she would be more than pleased for that debt to be taken to court, because then, finally, the whole region would learn how that debt was born, and whose hand had actually forged it. It was then that Theodore took a step forward and ordered Bessie to bring out the old ledger book. In front of Phineas, the bailiff, and all those present, the colonel opened the book to the revealing page and began reading aloud, slowly, so no one missed a single syllable, the records proving the cattle fraud. He read the names, the dates, the amounts, the trail of the money that had left Jacob's pocket through a signature obtained by deceit and ended up, through crooked paths, and a frontman named Hiram Cobb, in the hands of a single, true beneficiary. And when he pronounced, looking deep into his enemy's eyes, the name Phineas Montgomery as the mastermind of that swindle, the man's smile collapsed completely, and a murmur of scandal rippled across the porch. Phineas tried to deny it, stammered, said it was all made up, old papers that proved nothing, and threatened to sue the colonel for slander. But Theodore, with the serenity of a man holding the truth in his hands, replied that it was splendid then, that they should take the case to court right away, both of them, and that the same judge who would rule on the widow's debt could also rule on the origin of that debt, and that Hiram Cobb, the frontman who still lived in the area and owed far too many favors to far too many folks, could be called to testify about who had actually given him his orders. Hearing that, Phineas went white as a sheet, because he knew that Hiram, once cornered, would hand him over without a second thought to save his own hide. The bailiff, a serious man, collected the ledger as evidence, stated that this entirely changed the nature of the case, and that the matter would indeed have to go to trial, but now with the defendant sitting on the other side of the bench. The reversal was absolute. Phineas Montgomery, who had marched up to Hopewell to humiliate a defenseless widow, marched down with his tail between his legs, unmasked in front of witnesses, knowing that his name, of which he was so vainly protective, was now stained forever. In the following months, with Hiram Cobb's testimony and the evidence from the ledger, the law not only completely annulled the debt weighing on Cora, recognizing it as the fruit of fraud, but also forced Phineas to answer for his crimes, to return what he had wrongfully taken from so many folks, and to pay heavy fines that shook his fortune to the core. His daughter Dorothy, who was never at fault for her father's wickedness, ended up marrying for love to a simple, hard-working young man from the area, far from the ambitions her father had tried to force upon her, and that was, perhaps, the only good thing that sprouted from that family. As for Mrs. Martha Higgins and her gossiping circle, when the truth spread through town, they swallowed their own words dry, and for a good long while they avoided speaking of the widow Reynolds, because shame, when it hits home, tends to silence even the sharpest tongues. But not everything resolved itself as if by magic, because life is rarely like that. And before peace could settle, there was still one last test for the hearts of those two. With the debt annulled and her name cleared, Cora suddenly found herself at a crossroads that filled her with doubts. Now that she was free, now that she owed nothing to anyone and could start her life over wherever she pleased, a stubborn little voice inside her said that perhaps it would be more dignified to leave, to walk away from Hopewell, so that no one could ever say she had stayed for the money, so that Theodore's love, if it were true, wouldn't bear even the shadow of suspicion. And it was overcome by this painful thought that she, one afternoon, sought out the colonel and told him with her heart in pieces that perhaps the time had come for her to go her own way. Theodore heard that and felt the ground drop from beneath his feet. He asked why, and Cora explained with eyes brimming with tears that she didn't want anyone to ever be able to say she had taken advantage of him, that she'd rather carry the heartbreak of missing him than carry that stain, and that perhaps it was for the best for both of them. And it was then that this man, who for 7 years had kept his heart locked under 7 keys, just like that second-floor bedroom, finally flung open everything he felt. He said he didn't care what the town said, that he had wasted too much of his life caring about that already, and that if there was one thing she had taught him in all those months, it was that a person's happiness cannot be held hostage by the mouths of others. He said she hadn't saved him from bankruptcy or any debt, but she had saved him from something much worse, which was the utter loneliness of a man who considered himself dead while still breathing. And he said finally with a choked voice, the very thing that had weighed heavily on his chest for so long, that he loved her like he never imagined he could be capable of loving again, and that if she walked away, she would take with her the only piece of life that had returned to that house. Cora was crying now, unable to contain herself, but they were different tears, the kind that wash the soul clean. She told him she loved him too, that she had loved him for a long time, and had fought against it with all her strength because she felt she had no right to it, out of fear of dreaming again after life had already taken so much from her. And it was there, on the porch of Hopewell Ranch, with the sun setting golden over the valley and the meadowlarks singing in the distance, that Theodore finally took her in his arms and kissed her. A long and tender kiss. The kiss of two hearts that had crossed deserts to find one another, and who now clung to each other's lives with the quiet certainty of those who have finally arrived home. Bessie, peeking from the kitchen, let a tear drop onto her bread dough and ran to light a candle in gratitude, because she knew better than anyone the sheer size of the miracle that had just occurred in that house of shadows. The wedding took place months later, on a clear morning under a washed, clean sky, and it wasn't at the church in Oakhaven, but right there at Hopewell, beneath the great oak tree in the yard, with the presence of a preacher from a neighboring parish. The ranch hands, the maids, Bessie weeping tears of joy, and old man Silas, the only one in town who had always treated Cora with respect, who made a point of walking all the way up to the ranch just to see the woman he had always called the daughter of his heart finally happy. There was no luxury, but there was joy to spare. There was fiddle and banjo. There was hearty food and free laughter, and there was, above all, the miracle of seeing two human beings whom life had broken become whole again through each other's love. Cora wore a simple white dress with a prairie flower in her hair, and Theodore, looking at her at the foot of the makeshift altar, had a light in his eyes that no one had seen in that man for 7 long years. The wedding party carried on deep into the night, and it was as if Hopewell wanted to make up for, in a single celebration, all the years of silence it had endured. There was a bonfire and fiddle music once again. There was the same old Jed leading a lively jig on his banjo. There was an abundant table and dancing in the yard until the moon sat high in the sky. The hands toasted the newlyweds with hot cider and improvised verses. Bessie cried the entire night from pure bliss, and even some folks from town, who years earlier had rooted against that union, came up to the ranch to offer their blessings. Ashamed of the past, but sincere in the present, Cora received everyone without a shadow of resentment, and with every embrace she gave, she buried a little more of her old pain, understanding that forgiving is not forgetting what hurt, but choosing not to carry that weight for the rest of the journey. Among those who came up was the youngest daughter of one of Mrs. Martha Higgins's friends, a girl named Abigail, who years ago had laughed at the gossip against Cora, and who now, with her head bowed down, came to apologize for the malice she had helped spread. Cora took her hands, told her everything was all right, that life teaches everyone in due time, and offered her a plate of sweets like someone sealing a peace treaty. The girl left in tears, moved by the greatness of the woman she had helped wound so deeply, and she told the whole town what had happened, so that Cora's name, which had once been synonymous with scandal, gradually turned, by word of mouth, into a synonym for kindness and dignity, and so the very tongues of the people that had knocked her down eventually made sure to lift her up, proving that the truth, even when it takes its sweet time, always ends up finding its way back. On that first night as husband and wife, once the party had ended, Theodore and Cora walked up the staircase of the main house together, and he didn't lead her to the locked room of the past, which would remain forever kept as a reliquary of longing, but to a new, airy room he had ordered prepared with immense care, with windows facing the east, so that every morning would begin with light. They stopped by the window, looking at the moon over the silent valley, and Theodore took Cora's hands in his and said, with a voice thick with emotion, that he had spent 7 years believing all the good life had to offer was left behind, and she had proven to him that the very best is sometimes exactly what we haven't even lived yet. Cora rested her head against his chest, listened to the firm and serene beating of that man's heart, and felt, at long last, at home. Not the house of wood and shingle, but that other home, the one we find when we find the right person, and which no storm in this world can ever tear down. Life at Hopewell after that day kept transforming slowly, the way true things transform, without rushing and without boasting. The house that once lived in the dark was filled with light once more. Cora ordered all the windows opened, pulled down the dark cloths that had covered the furniture since the old morning, filled the rooms with prairie flowers and the smell of good cooking, and her laughter, and Bessie's, and even Theodore's, who was relearning how to laugh like a man, relearning how to walk after a bad fall, began echoing through the halls that for so long had only known silence. The ranch hands murmured among themselves in awe that the boss was a changed man, that he greeted them, asked after everyone's families, sometimes even cracked a dry joke in the middle of a chore, and that it was a mighty fine thing to work on a ranch where joy had returned to live. One of the first things Theodore did after the wedding was something he had put off for 7 years. On a sunny morning, he grabbed the rusty key he kept in a drawer and, holding Cora's hand, walked up to the second-floor hallway and finally opened the door to the bedroom he had ordered locked the day he lost Lavinia. They stepped inside together, and he let the light and the air enter that room, frozen in time, with dust dancing in the sunbeams. There was no more pain there, only a gentle, grateful nostalgia. Theodore told Cora happy stories about Lavinia, and Cora listened with tenderness, without a sliver of jealousy, understanding that a heart is large enough to hold the people we love without one stealing the place of another. They decided together to turn that room into a place of life once again, and so it was that the house, little by little, kept healing from all its wounds. But the miracle that moved everyone the most happened in the courtyard with the rosebush. Cora, who from her very first day had felt a strange affection for that dead bush planted by Lavinia, hadn't the heart to rip it out, as many suggested. Instead, she began caring for it like someone nursing a stubborn hope. Every morning she watered the soil around its twisted branches, loosened the dirt, fed it with cured manure, pulled out the weeds, and talked to that seemingly dead plant the way Lavinia once talked to it, whispering that there was still time, that it was never too late to start over, that if a heart as hard as the Colonel's had bloomed again, a simple rosebush could surely try as well. Bessie thought it was a waste of time, saying that bush had been dead for years, and not even a saint could revive a dried-up plant, but Cora wouldn't give up, and Theodore, deeply moved, let her be, because he saw in that stubborn gesture the very story of the two of them. And then, on a spring morning, when the good rains had already washed the prairie and the air smelled of wet earth and wild blooms, Bessie let out a shout in the kitchen that woke the entire house. Cora came running, her heart in her throat, thinking it was a tragedy, and what she found was the old cook standing frozen before the window, her hand over her mouth and her eyes overflowing, pointing out to the courtyard. There, amidst the branches everyone had given up for dead, a bud had sprouted. A single, small red bud, timid, but alive, open to the sun, like a fulfilled promise. Lavinia's rosebush, after 7 years of silence, was blooming again under Cora's care, and it was impossible for anyone there not to understand the message in that flower. Theodore, hastily summoned, came running from the corral, and upon seeing the red bud shining among the branches, that large and severe man had to lean against the wall because his legs gave out and his eyes filled with tears. He hugged Cora from behind, rested his chin on her shoulder, and the two stood like that in silence, watching the rose be born, understanding that life, when we water it with love and patience, always finds a way to bloom again. From then on, the rosebush never stopped giving flowers, and it became the pride of Hopewell, so full of red roses that it perfumed the entire courtyard and graced the dining table all year round. and the folks from the region who once came up to the ranch full of prejudice began coming up full of admiration, because the story of the colonel who learned to smile again, and the wronged widow who cleared her own name and conquered the most closed-off heart in the county, spread from mouth to mouth, only now with awe rather than malice. Even Mrs. Martha Higgins, now quite elderly, one day walked up to the ranch humbled to ask for a cutting of that miraculous rosebush, and Cora, who had learned from her own pain that resentment is a poison we drink thinking it will poison the other, not only gave her the cutting but welcomed her with coffee and a slice of cake, proving that true goodness is always greater than the memory of the offense. But perhaps nothing showed the size of that woman's heart as clearly as what happened a few years later, when a brutal drought struck the entire region. The rains failed for months on end, the creeks dried up, the crops withered on the stalk, and many humble families in Oakhaven, who lived off the little they planted, suddenly found themselves with nothing to put in the pot. Hopewell, with its deep wells and plentiful storehouses, was one of the few properties to make it through the dry spell without much strain, largely thanks to Cora's careful management, as she always set aside surplus from the good years for the bad ones. And when she learned of the hunger falling over the town, she had no doubt about what to do. She went to her husband and proposed opening the ranch's granaries to help anyone in need, and Theodore, who had long since learned to trust the judgment and the heart of that woman, agreed without batting an eye. Thus, during the hardest months of the drought, Hopewell became a beacon of hope for the entire region. Cora organized the distribution of sacks of corn and beans, ordered the surplus milk and meat to be shared, opened the ranch's watering holes so neighbors could quench the thirst of their few animals, and received everyone with the same dignity, never making anyone feel the humiliating weight of charity. Many of those who now came up, hat in hand, to receive help were the very same ones who years earlier had turned up their noses at the poor widow, and she, who could have demanded payment for their past cruelty, treated each one with an affection that shamed and healed them at the same time. When the rains finally returned and the land turned green again, Cora's name had permanently entered the hearts of those people, no longer as the cursed widow of old, but as the Lady of Hopewell, who had saved the county from starvation. Theodore watched all this with a quiet pride, and used to say, whenever folks complimented his wife, that the greatest wealth he had ever gathered in life wasn't in land or in cattle, but on the day a brave woman knocked on his door asking for work. And the two of them, whom life had once punished so fiercely, discovered that the greatest happiness lay not just in the love they felt for each other, but in everything that this love, overflowing, was capable of doing for the world around them. The years passed over Hopewell the way the gentle waters of a good river flow. And so it was that, a long time later, on a golden autumn afternoon, a traveler riding up the red dirt road, looking for a place to rest, came across a scene he would never forget. On the porch of the grand house, two no longer young people sat side by side on a swinging bench, holding hands, watching the sun set over the valley. He, with white hair and serene eyes, was telling a story that made her laugh, that rich, warm laugh of someone who has been happy their entire life. She, still beautiful despite her graying hair, tenderly straightened his shirt collar with the intimacy of couples who have grown old together, loving each other a little more each day. In the yard, an immense red rosebush glowed in the late afternoon light, and the whole air smelled of roses and fresh brewed coffee. The traveler, enchanted, asked an old ranch hand mending a fence nearby who those happy folks were, and the hand, with a proud smile, replied that they were Colonel Theodore and Miss Cora, the owners of that land, and that theirs was the most beautiful love story the region had ever seen. He recounted with a choked voice that many years ago no one gave a dime for that marriage, that the whole town rooted against them, that they tried to tear them apart in every way possible, but that their love had been stronger than the malice of men, stronger than time, than injustice, and stronger than the very death that had visited them both before they found each other. He said that Miss Cora was known throughout the county for her goodness, that she helped the poor, taught the ranch hands' children to read and do sums, and that there wasn't a single door in Oakhaven that wouldn't open with respect and affection at the sound of her name, the very name that Malice had once tried to drag through the mud. And so, my dear viewer, ends this story, but perhaps the most beautiful part of it all isn't the happy ending, but what it teaches us. Because life often knocks us down in a way we swear we'll never be able to get back up. Sometimes we lose the ones we love. Sometimes we are judged for pains we didn't choose. Sometimes the whole world seems to gang up against us. But the story of Cora and Theodore reminds us that the human heart, no matter how dried out it seems, no matter how many years it spends in the dark, always holds, deep down, a living root, just waiting for the right care, the right person, the right love, to bloom all over again. No one is ever so broken that they can't become whole again, and no winter, no matter how long, has ever been able to stop the arrival of spring forever. If this story touched your heart, leave your opinion down below in the comments. Tell me which part moved you the most, and share this video with that person who needs to hear that it is never too late to start over. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe here to the Tales of Yesteryear channel, because it is like this, with your company, that we keep bringing stories of love, of faith, and of overcoming to warm your heart. May the good Lord bless you and your family, and until our next story.